The biceps. What muscle group is a more classic example of someone who is muscular and well-trained? You look across people and the biceps pose is one of the most accepted demonstrations of health and strength. The biceps, or biceps brachii, is one of the main muscles that makes up our upper arm. It actually consists of two heads, which is where the name bicep brachii comes from, meaning two-headed muscle of the arm. These two heads have pretty simple names, the short head and the long head. The short head originates on the coracoid process of the shoulder blade, whereas the long arm originates on the supraglenoid tubercle. They both run down along the front of the upper arm, merging together into one muscle belly. They then form one tendon called the distal biceps tendon, which passes the elbow, inserting into the radial tuberosity of the radius bone in the forearm. From the origin and insertion, we can see the bicep crosses three joints, the shoulder, then the two joints in the elbow. As such, the bicep has three primary functions: assisting in shoulder flexion and abduction, also known as raising the arm overhead, elbow flexion, or bending the elbow, and forearm supination, which is turning the palm up. Now, it's important to note when most people are referring to the biceps, they're actually referring to more than just the biceps itself. Usually people are talking about the muscles that collectively perform elbow flexion, which is the biceps brachii, but also the brachialis and brachioradialis. This is valuable to note since the bicep only accounts for about 40 to 45% of the muscle volume in the anterior arm, with the brachialis making up about 30 to 35%, and the brachioradialis making up around the last 15-ish%. Given that these two muscles account for so much size in what we generally call the biceps, it's important that we consider them as well. The brachialis and brachioradialis differ from the biceps brachii in that they are more single joint muscles. Generally, they're both thought to primarily only do elbow flexion, but the brachioradialis can also assist in forearm rotation in each direction depending upon the position of the forearm. With the anatomy covered, we can start to layer on more information that helps us decide which are the best exercises for the elbow flexors and help us understand how to best do these movements for growing them to the best degree possible. A few key things that we want to factor in for the biceps and the other flexors is the impact of forearm position and action, impact of shoulder position and action, and then peak torque. We discussed earlier that the biceps has an action of supination and the brachioradialis can do both supination and pronation. This is important to remember because we see that the relative position and challenge on the forearm impacts the usage of these muscles. If we want to emphasize the biceps brachii, doing elbow flexion with supination will increase the usage. If we want to emphasize the brachioradialis, doing elbow flexion with pronation will increase that focus. Whereas the brachialis will be challenged similarly regardless of the forearm position. As well, we had previously discussed the brachioradialis and the brachialis are primarily single joint muscles, and that the biceps brachii also crosses the shoulder. Due to this, the biceps is often stated as a shoulder flexor and abductor, but research has shown it's relatively inactive during this, likely due to the path that it takes of passing the shoulder. Instead, it acts more as a stabilizer of the shoulder joint. Now, while it might not actively lift the shoulder, when the shoulder does change positions, it can impact the length of the actual biceps, impacted by shoulder flexion and extension. When the shoulder is in a more extended position, the biceps will be lengthened, whereas when it's in a more flexed position, it'll be more shortened. Muscle length is an important factor to consider as we've seen that it can impact the growth of a muscle. We're going to dig into this in a bit more detail in a later moment in the video. Generally, the elbow flexor muscles have the least leverage to produce force when the arm is straight, and most as the elbow flexion angle increases. With that said, the elbow flexors do differ in when they produce the best force. The biceps has a peak torque right around 45 degrees of elbow flexion, whereas the brachioradialis is closer to 80 degrees of elbow flexion. And the brachialis is somewhere in the middle. This information is helpful because different exercises are challenging at different points in the range of motion, which will challenge each of these muscles to a different degree. For instance, if we have a movement that is more challenging at the top, like a band curl, it will heavily impact and challenge the brachioradialis more to take the peak challenge at the top position. In contrast, a standard standing dumbbell curl will be the most challenging around the middle position due to the lever arm, making it the most all-around challenging to each of the three muscles. With all of that information, we can start to outline which exercises would be the best exercises for the various elbow flexors and overall. Let's start off with the best exercises for each of the muscles in the group. First up, the king of them, the biceps brachii. When it comes to maximally developing the biceps brachii, we want a movement that is either going to have supination throughout the motion, like a rotating dumbbell curl, or have you maintain supination through the whole motion, like a barbell curl. We also want to try to use non-accommodating resistance since we want it to be most challenging more towards the lower range of motion, so dumbbells, barbells, or cables are often best. Then, having a rotation of exercises that work the muscle in a different length by changing the shoulder position is ideal. Having an exercise like an incline dumbbell curl is beneficial to work it at a longer length, and this might even emphasize the long head of the biceps particularly. Then having an exercise like a preacher curl where the shoulder is going to be partially flexed, but not to a significant degree, limiting tension. And this will shift the peak point of torque more towards that lower position, which is going to be beneficial for maximally challenging the biceps. This combination should effectively hit the biceps brachii. For the brachioradialis, we want to go in the complete opposite direction. It's best to go to a pronated grip position, like a reverse curl, to get the most out of the brachioradialis. Loading it up with some sort of accommodating resistance can be beneficial as well, since that peak torque is more towards the top end position. Ideally, you'd want to have a movement like a reverse barbell curl or easy bar curl with some weight, and then adding some band resistance. That way you can have challenge throughout the whole motion, and then some added challenge at that peak position. For the brachialis, it's a little bit more simple. We can effectively hit it well with just about any free weight curl, whether it's a dumbbell curl, hammer curl, or a barbell curl. Legitimately focusing on the brachialis is pretty hard. When we do any supinated grip, the biceps will be more heavily worked, whereas with a pronated grip, the brachioradialis will be more heavily focused on. In a neutral grip, we will have a degree of emphasis on the brachialis, so it might be the best position, but because both the biceps and the brachioradialis will still be assisting to do overall elbow flexion, we can't necessarily focus on it. That's why just generally training both will be sufficient for hitting the brachialis. Now, some people aren't going to want to do a bunch of different exercises, but instead they just want one or two that's going to be the best for overall developing the elbow flexors. In that case, my first choice would be a Zottman curl. Here we start with the palms up, curling all the way to the top, then at the top, rotate the palms down and lower under control, and then flip back to do the next rep. The reason this is one of my top picks is that we basically ensure we do a comprehensive challenge across all of the elbow flexors here, hitting the biceps on the way up, and then controlling it down with more of the brachioradialis and hitting the brachialis across the whole rep. My second choice would be the standard barbell or dumbbell curl. With this, we start off standing tall, curl either the dumbbells or the barbell up, and then lower it under control. With the dumbbells, you can play around with rotation if you prefer, getting a little bit of variation each time, but it's not critical. I personally think that for most people, simple is best. If you're training large compound movements like pull-ups, rows, etc., and then hitting the biceps once or twice a week, which is honestly more than most people need, then you're going to be in a good position and you don't necessarily need to do a ton of different movements. Instead, you need to pick just some good, solid movements that hit it comprehensively and allow you to progressively overload it across time. That's where these two might honestly be the best option for the vast majority of people, because it's going to emphasize and challenge the biceps, brachialis, and still get the brachioradialis to a degree. And then over time, you can progress that. So those are going to be the best biceps exercises, and also for the other elbow flexors. Now, for anyone wondering why my one bicep looks really different than my other one, I basically tore water skiing like an idiot. Didn't know what I was doing, tried to be impressive, and then boom, popped. And that was about a year and a half ago, and it's definitely done a lot better over the course of the time. And I've tried to use some exercises, as we've discussed today, to rehab it. But at the end of the day, that's why it looks a little bit different. So hopefully that video helped you guys out, gave you a lot of information across how you can best develop your biceps, the overall elbow flexors, and it's going to help you build some huge pythons. If you want us to cover any other videos, comment down below and let us know. Appreciate you watching, smash that like button, and we'll see you in the next video.